2:15 in the morning, the southern reaches of the ZAGROS Mountains. The F-15E Strike Eagle, call sign Reaper 0-1, was carving a silent path through the thin air at 24,000 feet. The mission was a standard surveillance sweep of the coastal corridors, but the electronic warfare officer noticed a series of low-frequency pulses that did not belong in this sector. The crew sat in a cockpit illuminated by the eerie green glow of the multifunction displays, their breathing steady through the oxygen masks. Somewhere in the dark terrain below, a radar signature was flickering that did not match the pre-flight intelligence briefing provided to the crew before they departed from the airbase in the United Arab Emirates. Could a mobile air defense unit have moved 40 miles into the mountains without being detected by the last satellite pass? The thin air outside the fuselage carried the sharp, biting cold of the high altitude, while the scent of recycled air and warm electronics filled the small space of the cockpit. Below them, the rugged terrain was a sea of ink and shadows, hiding the reality of a battlefield that was supposed to be empty of modern threats. The Central Command Intelligence Assessment, dated 48 hours prior, had assessed the Iranian mobile surface-to-air missile capability in the Hormozgan province as degraded and confined to the coastal highways. This assessment formed the basis of the mission profile, allowing Reaper 0-1 to fly a predictable pattern over the mountain peaks, without the need for a dedicated electronic warfare escort. Captain Miller, the pilot, adjusted the throttle slightly to maintain a steady airspeed of 480 knots as they approached the next waypoint. In the rear seat, Major Vance monitored the synthetic aperture radar, looking for any signs of movement along the supply routes that threaded through the valleys below. The mission was intended to be a 12-hour endurance flight, requiring 2 mid-air refuelings and a constant vigilance that had already begun to wear on the crew's focus. Vance checked his survival vest, patting the pocket that held his personal survival radio, a device that he had personally inspected for hours before the flight to ensure the antenna was seated perfectly. The mountain range beneath the aircraft was a labyrinth of limestone and shale, creating a complex radar environment that produced frequent false positives. Miller watched the digital terrain system, ensuring they stayed well above the highest peaks, which reached over 12,000 feet in this specific sector. The wind at this altitude was screaming past the canopy at over 500 miles per hour, though the sound was muffled by the thick flight helmets and the constant drone of the twin engines. Every system on the F-15E Strike Eagle indicated a healthy aircraft, from the hydraulic pressures to the fuel flow rates. Despite the calm indicators, the electronic warfare display began to show a persistent signal that the onboard computer could not immediately identify. It was a high-frequency chirp, characteristic of a targeting radar, but it was coming from a location that the intelligence report had marked as a desolate plateau with no road access. The crew discussed the anomaly over the internal communication system, their voices calm and professional as they cross-referenced the coordinates with their digital maps. They were now 40 miles from the nearest friendly territory, operating in an environment where any error in judgment could lead to a catastrophic loss of the airframe. The silence of the night was only broken by the occasional crackle of the long-range radio as they checked in with the Regional Air Traffic Control Center. Miller felt a slight vibration in the stick, a minor turbulence caused by the mountain waves rolling over the high ridges below them. He tightened his grip, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a launch plume or the glint of an incoming threat. The mission was nearing its halfway point, and the fatigue of the long flight was beginning to settle into the muscles of his shoulders and neck. The signature element of this mission was the absolute reliance on the intelligence assessment that the sector was a low-threat environment. This confidence allowed the aircraft to operate with its radar in an active mode, broadcasting its position to anyone with the equipment to listen. Captain Miller and Major Vance were flying into a gap between what they had been told and what was actually waiting for them in the shadows of the ZAGROS peaks. The mission context had changed without their knowledge, and the unanswered question remained whether they would realize the danger before the first missile left its rail. The mission profile for Reaper 0-1 had been finalized at the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, 6 hours before the wheels left the tarmac. The tactical objective was to provide high-resolution imagery and electronic signal intelligence of the newly constructed transport hubs near the city of Lar, deep within the southern Iranian interior. The Air Tasking Order had allocated a total of 4 hours of time on station, supported by a KC-135 Stratotanker orbiting over the Gulf of Oman for the necessary mid-air refuelings. This mission was part of a larger effort to monitor the flow of ballistic missile components from the coastal ports into the mountain bunkers. The tactical plan rested entirely on the belief that the Strike Eagle would be operating in a permissive electronic environment. The 5th Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 3 days prior, had assessed the Iranian mobile surface-to-air missile capability in the ZAGROS range as non-operational due to the extreme grades and lack of paved infrastructure. The intelligence brief explicitly stated that the heavy transporter erector launcher vehicles required for the HQ-9 systems were incapable of navigating the narrow switchbacks and unpaved passes that defined the LAR plateau. Based on this specific intelligence, the flight path of Reaper 0-1 was designed for maximum sensor coverage rather than maximum survivability. Captain Miller and Major Vance had reviewed these assessments during the pre-flight briefing. They were told that the only credible threats in the area were legacy short-range systems and anti-aircraft artillery, neither of which could reach the 24,000-foot cruise altitude of the F-15E Strike Eagle. The plan was to fly a series of overlapping figure-8 patterns, allowing the synthetic aperture radar to build a detailed three-dimensional map of the targets below. Because of the assessed low threat level, the aircraft was not assigned a dedicated suppression of enemy air defenses escort, leaving Miller and Vance to rely on their onboard jamming pods and towed decoys. The cockpit of the Strike Eagle was a cramped environment of high-tensile steel and advanced composite materials, smelling of the ozone generated by the massive cooling fans of the radar processors. As they banked into their third orbit, the air outside was a frigid -40 degrees, but the heat from the massive twin engines kept the fuselage skin warm to the touch. Major Vance, in the rear seat, was managing a complex array of sensor feeds, his fingers dancing across the buttons of his hand controllers with the muscle memory of 1,000 flight hours. He was confident in the intelligence they had been given, even as he performed a routine check on his survival equipment. He specifically looked at the pouch containing the CSEL survival radio, the primary link between a downed pilot and the rescue forces. He recalled the briefing from the survival specialist about the ruggedness of the ZAGROS mountains, where the jagged limestone could rip through flight suits and equipment with ease. The signature element of their preparation was the emphasis on the radio's integrity. Vance had double-checked the antenna connection, ensuring the flexible wire was tucked securely within the protective sleeve of the vest. If the aircraft were lost, that radio would be the only thing separating them from a permanent stay in the Iranian wilderness. Below them, the terrain was a jagged wasteland of shadows and deep ravines, where the temperature on the ground was significantly higher than at altitude, creating thermal layers that could distort radar returns. The mission was proceeding with the clinical precision of a training exercise. The Air Traffic Control Center at the airbase continued to track their transponder, their voices providing a rhythmic cadence of status updates every 15 minutes. Miller maintained a steady hand on the stick, the flight control system making hundreds of micro-adjustments every second to compensate for the thin mountain air. The tactical plan also included a secondary objective of identifying any hidden communication nodes along the ridges. The intelligence assessment had categorized these nodes as low-priority targets, believing them to be manned by local paramilitary forces with limited technological capability. This assumption allowed Miller to fly closer to the ridgelines than he would have in a more contested sector. The crew was operating under the impression that they were the apex predators in this piece of sky, protected by the most advanced stealth and electronic warfare technology the United States could provide. As they reached the northernmost point of their orbit, the sun began to hint at the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the peaks. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the lethality of the mission. The Strike Eagle moved with a grace that belied its heavy combat load, its wings biting into the cold air as it turned back toward the coast. The tactical plan was half complete, the data was flowing into the recorders, and the crew was already discussing the post-mission debrief. They remained unaware that the intelligence assessment regarding the HQ-9 systems was about to be tested by a reality that had not appeared on any satellite image. 2:52 in the morning. The coordinates were 27 degrees, 22 minutes north, 54 degrees, 18 minutes east. Reaper 0-1 was banking into its final surveillance leg over the Lar Plateau, its nose pointed toward a heading of 095. The F-15E Strike Eagle moved through the night with a heavy, deliberate stability, the two Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines burning fuel at a combined rate of 8,000 pounds per hour. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was a mix of intense concentration and the physical strain of 5 hours in a pressurized flight suit. Captain Miller adjusted the brightness on his head-up display, the green symbology reflecting off his visor as he monitored the digital terrain following system. The mountain ridges below were passing by like the teeth of a giant saw, each peak rising to within 10,000 feet of their belly. The flight path was designed to maximize the look angle of the AN/APG-82 active electronically scanned array radar. In the rear cockpit, Major Vance was looking through the lantern targeting pod, his screen showing the thermal signatures of a small convoy moving along a dirt track 3 miles below. The intelligence briefing from the previous night had identified this specific track as a secondary logging road, incapable of supporting heavy military hardware. Vance zoomed the infrared camera, watching the white-hot heat signatures of the truck exhausts as they crawled through a narrow canyon. Everything about the scene appeared routine, reinforcing the assessment that this was a low-threat sector of the Iranian interior. The transition to an emergency state did not begin with a loud noise or a physical jolt. It began with a single, persistent tone in the headsets of the crew. The ALR-67 radar warning receiver, the primary defense against surface-to-air threats, suddenly shifted from a passive scanning mode to a high-priority alert. A diamond symbol appeared on the threat display, indicating a Big Bird acquisition radar had just achieved a lock-on from a position directly ahead of the aircraft. This was the specific radar associated with the HQ-9 long-range missile system, the very weapon that the 5th Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment had claimed could not be deployed in this rugged terrain. The tone in Miller's ears changed from a steady pulse to a frantic, high-pitched warble, indicating that the ground-based system had transitioned from tracking to a terminal guidance lock. "Vance, I have a track-while-scan lock at 12 o'clock high," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave as the adrenaline hit his system. He immediately slammed the throttles forward into full afterburner, the twin engines dumping raw fuel into the exhaust to produce 68,000 pounds of thrust. The Strike Eagle kicked forward, the sudden acceleration pinning both men into their ejection seats with 3 Gs of force. The silence of the cockpit was gone, replaced by the roar of the engines and the screaming of the onboard computers. Miller initiated a hard bank to the left, pulling the stick toward his hip to execute a 5G brake turn designed to beam the incoming radar signal. Major Vance was already working the electronic warfare suite, punching the buttons to deploy a string of chaff and flares from the dispensers located on the underside of the fuselage. He watched the displays as the aircraft's internal jammer attempted to correlate the incoming signal and broadcast a digital deception pattern. The air outside the cockpit was no longer just a cold vacuum. It was now a lethal medium filled with invisible energy that was searching for the metallic skin of their aircraft. The heat from the afterburners was now a massive infrared beacon, and Miller knew that if a missile had already been launched, they were in a desperate race against physics. The altitude was 24,000 feet, and the airspeed was climbing through Mach 0.9. The vibration through the airframe was intense, the sound of the wind screaming past the canopy like a physical weight. Vance checked the data link, hoping to see a supporting aircraft on the screen, but the display showed they were entirely alone in this sector. The nearest friendly asset was a destroyer, the DDG-51, located over 180 miles to the south in the Gulf of Oman. They were deep within the kill envelope of a system they had been told was hundreds of miles away. The transition was complete. The mission of surveillance had become a mission of survival in less than 12 seconds. Miller gripped the stick with both hands, his knuckles white against the dark gloves as he searched the darkness below for the telltale flash of a missile launch. The acrid smell of ozone in the cockpit seemed to intensify, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of the pilot's own sweat. Every system on the aircraft was now dedicated to a single purpose: breaking the lock of a weapons system that the intelligence community had officially assessed as being nowhere near these coordinates. As the Strike Eagle leveled off at 30,000 feet, the radar warning receiver suddenly went silent for 2 seconds. The relief was momentary. Then, the tone returned, louder and faster than before. The ground operators had not lost the track. They had simply switched to a different frequency to bypass the initial jamming. Miller realized then that the intelligence gap was not just a minor error. It was a fundamental failure that had placed them in the crosshairs of a fully operational and highly competent air defense unit. 2:54 in the morning. The LAR Plateau. The electronic warfare environment over the southern Zagros was no longer a void. It was a saturated landscape of pulse repetition frequencies and high-power microwave energy that the onboard computer struggled to categorize. Major Vance watched the digital display as the single HQ-9 signature suddenly fractured into 3 distinct emitters, indicating a coordinated battery operation. The intelligence assessment had stated that the rugged terrain would prevent the integration of multiple radar units, yet the data link showed a seamless handoff between the acquisition radar and the engagement radar. The Strike Eagle was being hunted by a network that was operating with the efficiency of a frontline defensive tier. "Break right! Break right! Flare! Flare! Flare!" Vance shouted over the intercom, his voice strained by the 5 Gs of centrifugal force, as Miller threw the aircraft into a descending spiral. Through the canopy, the darkness of the Iranian interior was punctuated by a sharp, magnesium-bright flash on the valley floor. A column of white-hot propellant rose from the plateau, accelerating at a rate that the flight computer calculated as Mach 4 in under 6 seconds. This was the reality of the HQ-9 missile, a weapon system that utilized a track-via missile guidance system, rendering the Strike Eagle's internal jammers nearly useless. The missile did not follow a predictable lead pursuit curve. It climbed high into the thin air, looking down at the F-15E Strike Eagle with a lethal, unblinking electronic eye. Miller hauled the stick back, attempting to use the vertical plane to bleed the missile's kinetic energy. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines screamed in full afterburner, 2 massive torches of blue flame pushing the airframe to its structural limits. The air outside was 30 degrees below zero. But the friction of the Mach 1.2 dash through the atmosphere was heating the leading edges of the wings to over 200 degrees. The aircraft shuddered violently as it hit the transonic barrier, a physical vibration that rattled the teeth of the crew. The gap between the intelligence briefing and the physical reality was now a matter of meters and milliseconds. The pre-mission satellite imagery had confirmed the target position as empty water and desolate rock, yet the aircraft was now locked in a terminal engagement with a battery that had clearly been dug into the limestone ridges for weeks. The HQ-9 missile performed a high-speed pitch adjustment. Its control fins, biting into the thin air as it corrected its intercept point. Miller saw the glint of the missile's seeker head in his peripheral vision, a silver speck against the black sky that was closing at 3,000 feet per second. The Strike Eagle's automated defense system launched a final, desperate salvo of flare and chaff, but the missile ignored the decoys. The guidance logic of the HQ-9 was designed to exploit the specific gap in the Strike Eagle's older electronic countermeasures suite, a gap that intelligence had claimed the Iranians were 10 years away from. Understanding. The missile did not impact the fuselage directly. It detonated 15 feet from the left engine nozzle, a proximity fuse triggered by the massive infrared signature of the afterburners. The world inside the cockpit turned into a chaos of orange light and screaming metal. The explosion punched a hole through the left horizontal stabilizer and shredded the hydraulic lines of the primary flight control system. Miller felt the stick go limp in his hands for a fraction of a second before the backup mechanical systems engaged. But the aircraft began a violent, uncommanded roll to the left. The left engine, its turbine blades shattered by the blast of shrapnel, disintegrated instantly. A massive fire erupted in the engine bay, the heat so intense that the magnesium alloy frames began to melt within seconds. The cockpit was filled with the acrid stink of burning JP-8 fuel and hydraulic fluid, a chemical cocktail that stung the eyes and choked the throat. Reaper 0-1 is hit. We are going down. We are going down, Miller transmitted, though the radio was already failing as the electrical bus shorted out. The aircraft was falling through 18,000 feet, spinning toward the jagged peaks of the ZAGROS range. The G-forces were oscillating wildly, pinning the crew against the sides of the canopy as the Strike Eagle entered a flat spin. The signature element of the disaster occurred in these final seconds of flight. As the aircraft tumbled, a piece of the shredded stabilizer whipped forward, striking the cast underside of the rear cockpit just as Major Vance prepared for ejection. The impact was minor in the context of the crash, but it sliced through the exterior housing of the survival radio bay, a detail that neither man could possibly notice in the life-or-death struggle. To exit the falling wreckage, Vance gripped the ejection handles between his legs. He looked at the back of Miller's helmet and saw the pilot fighting the controls until the very end, trying to steer the burning wreck away from a small village in the valley. The fire was now a solid wall of orange behind them, the slipstream dragging the flames across the canopy. There was no longer any aircraft to save. The intelligence failure was absolute, and the cost was a $30 million fighter jet and two of the Air Force's most experienced aviators. 14,000 feet. The Lar Plateau. Captain Miller gripped the yellow and black ejection handles between his knees and pulled upward with every ounce of strength remaining in his forearms. The sequence was automated, a mechanical symphony of survival that began with the explosive bolts of the canopy shattering the clear polycarbonate into 10,000 fragments. The wind, moving at over 400 miles per hour, slammed into the cockpit like a physical hammer, stripping away the maps and loose equipment in a single, violent gust. A fraction of a second later, the ACES-2 ejection seat in the rear cockpit fired its rocket motor, punching Major Vance through the wall of flame and into the freezing night air. 0.4 seconds later, Miller felt the crushing weight of the rocket motor beneath his own seat. He was propelled upward with 18 Gs of force, a pressure so intense it felt as though his spine were being driven into the cockpit floor. The world became a blur of orange fire and black sky as he cleared the burning twin tails of the Strike Eagle. The seatman separator fired, kicking him away from the heavy metal chair and allowing the drogue chute to deploy into the slipstream. The transition from the screaming chaos of the cockpit to the absolute silence of the high-altitude descent was a physical shock. The air was a frigid -35 degrees, carrying the faint, lingering stink of burnt powder and vaporized hydraulic fluid. Miller hung in his harness, the heavy nylon straps biting into his shoulders as the main parachute blossomed above him. Below, he watched the wreckage of Reaper 0-1 continue its flat spin, a trail of white-hot magnesium fire marking its path, until it slammed into a jagged ridge 3 miles to the east. The explosion was a soundless fireball that illuminated the limestone peaks for a single, haunting second before the darkness returned. Miller looked around, his eyes scanning the starlit sky for Vance's parachute. He saw a white canopy drifting several hundred meters above, and to the north, silhouetted against the rising moon. The wind was carrying them both toward a deep ravine, a landscape of razor-sharp shale and stunted juniper trees. Miller gripped the steering toggles of his parachute, his hands shaking from the adrenaline and the sudden, biting cold. He needed to avoid the high ridges, where the Iranian search teams would likely begin their sweep. The signature element of the disaster, which had occurred during the tumble of the aircraft, was now a critical factor on the ground. As Miller drifted, he reached for the survival radio in his vest. He did not yet know that the impact of the stabilizer had not just hit the fuselage. It had whipped across the back of the rear cockpit, snapping the flexible whip antenna of Vance's radio flush with the casing. This shear had removed 80% of the radio's transmission capability, leaving the weapons system officer with a device that could only reach a distance of 3 miles, far less than the 40 miles required to contact the nearest friendly assets. The descent took 6 minutes, a period of agonizing vulnerability as they drifted over a landscape that was now actively hunting them. Miller felt the thin air getting thicker and warmer as he dropped toward the 12,000-foot floor of the valley. He prepared for a high-altitude landing, a dangerous maneuver on such uneven ground. He pulled the release for his survival kit, letting the heavy bag drop on its 15-foot lanyard to clear his legs for the impact. The ground came up faster than he expected in the low light. Miller slammed into a steep slope of loose limestone, the impact rolling him forward and through a thicket of thorns. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his left ankle as his boot caught a crevice, but he didn't stop moving. He fought the parachute, pulling the shroud lines toward him to collapse the silk before the wind could drag him over the edge of a nearby cliff. Once the silk was gathered, Miller lay in the dead silence of the ZAGROS night. The only sound was the thumping of his own heart and the distant hiss of the cooling wreckage. A few miles away, the acrid smell of burnt metal was replaced by the dry, dusty scent of the Iranian highlands. He was on the ground, 40 miles from the nearest friendlies, in a sector that was supposed to be empty, but was actually teeming with the same air defense units that had just destroyed his aircraft. He reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the dials in the dark. He keyed the mic, hoping to hear Vance's voice, but the only sound in his headset was the low, rhythmic hiss of static. He was alone in the shadows, and the hunt was about to begin. 3 o'clock in the morning. The debris field of Reaper 0 to 1. The jagged slope was a graveyard of smoldering composite panels and twisted titanium. Captain Miller had managed to crawl 300 meters from his landing point, finding cover behind a cluster of limestone boulders that smelled of ancient dust and dry moss. To his north, the main fuselage of the F-15E Strike Eagle was a jagged silhouette of orange flame, the heat so intense it caused the air to shimmer and distort the stars above. He looked for the white silk of Vance's parachute, but the darkness was absolute, save for the flickering light of the burning jet fuel. A volley of 7.62mm rounds chewed through the juniper bushes, 3 inches above Captain Miller's head before he even heard the cyclic roar of the machine gun. The impact of the bullets sent splinters of dry wood and hot stone flying into his face, one fragment cutting a deep furrow across his cheek that immediately began to bleed. The ambush had come from a ridgeline less than 50 meters to his east, where a light infantry squad from a local paramilitary unit had been waiting in the shadows of the limestone. Miller rolled hard to his left, his body slamming into the dirt as he reached for his M9 sidearm, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The shooter had squeezed the trigger of a PKM machine gun, the weapon bucking against his shoulder as it spat a continuous stream of tracer fire into the ravine. The smell of burnt cordite and hot oil filled the narrow gap between the rocks as the belt of ammunition rattled through the feed tray. Each round left the barrel with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed off the canyon walls, the muzzle flash providing a brilliant, stuttering white light that bleached the shadows for seconds at a time. Miller fired back, 2 rounds from his pistol punching into the chest of the lead scout, who was rushing down the slope with a bayonet fixed to his rifle. The man was thrown backward, his weapon spinning into the darkness. As he collapsed into a patch of thorn bushes, his green fatigues turning a dark, wet crimson in the flickering firelight. A second Iranian soldier was hit in the shoulder by a follow-up shot, the force of the 9mm bullet spinning him around and slamming him against a jagged rock face with a sickening crunch of bone and gear. Captain Miller scrambled behind a larger boulder, his hands fumbling to eject the spent magazine while his boots kicked up clouds of white dust and gravel. He felt the intense heat of the nearby wreckage washing over him, the thermal energy of the burning engines creating a localized wind that whipped the smoke into a frenzy. His left ankle screamed in pain with every frantic movement, but the surge of adrenaline masked the worst of the injury as he braced his back against the cold stone and prayed for a moment of concealment. The canyon fell into a dead silence for 10 seconds, the only sound the crackle of the burning Strike Eagle and the distant, rhythmic thud of a secondary explosion within the wing tanks. A thick, oily smoke began to settle into the ravine, smelling of aerosolized jet fuel and the sharp, copper tang of fresh blood on the stones. Miller pulled his survival radio from his vest, his thumb pressing the transmit button with trembling force. He knew Vance was out there, somewhere in the dark, but he did not know about the shear that had claimed the other man's antenna. "Vance, this is Miller. I am taking fire at the wreckage. Do you copy?" "Vance, come in." He waited, his eyes darting between the ridges, but the headset remained a void of empty static. The signature element of the disaster was now a physical wall between the two men. The 3-mile limit on Vance's broken radio meant that even if he were shouting into the microphone just a few ridges away, the signal was being swallowed by the limestone before it could ever reach Miller's position. The intelligence assessment had claimed the area was unoccupied, but Miller could hear the shouting of at least a dozen more men moving through the rocks above him. They were moving with a professional discipline, using leapfrog tactics to close the distance to the crash site. The loss of the aircraft was a catastrophic blow to the mission, but the human cost was still being calculated in real time as Miller checked his remaining ammunition. He had 2 magazines left, a survival knife and a radio that was broadcasting into a silence that seemed to confirm he was entirely on his own. The heat from the burning fuselage was beginning to cook off the remaining 20mm cannon rounds in the aircraft's internal drum. Each detonation sounded like a heavy hammer striking an anvil, sending sparks and shrapnel into the air. Miller stayed low, his face pressed against the dirt, realizing that the very intelligence that had led them into this trap was now the reason no quick reaction force was already on the way. To the command center in Qatar, Reaper 0-1 was simply a lost blip on a screen 40 miles deep in hostile territory with no confirmed survivors. 3:35 in the morning. The Combined Air Operations Center The atmosphere within the windowless command floor had shifted from routine monitoring to the clinical, high-pressure cadence of a mounting recovery operation. Large digital displays that had previously shown the broad sweep of regional air traffic were now zoomed in on a single, flickering coordinate 40 miles north of the Iranian coastline. On the flight deck of the carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, the logistics of a combat search and rescue mission were unfolding with a speed that pushed the limits of the deck crew. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were being moved onto the catapults, their rotors already beginning to blur against the humid salt air, as the crews performed final engine checks. The logistics of penetrating 40 miles into a high-threat environment required a massive commitment of specialized equipment and personnel. Each MH-60 Sierra was being loaded with auxiliary fuel tanks to extend its loiter time, adding an additional 2,000 pounds of weight that decreased the aircraft's maneuverability but was essential for the deep inland mission. Four pararescue jumpers, specialists in high-altitude extraction and trauma medicine, were checking their gear bags. They carried specialized spinal boards, 4 units of O-negative blood kept in portable cooling units, and enough ammunition to hold a defensive perimeter for 6 hours if the extraction was delayed. The human cost of the mission was already being weighed by the medical teams. The flight surgeon on the carrier briefed the rescue teams on the specific injuries associated with a high-speed ejection from an F-15E Strike Eagle. At Mach 0.9, the physical trauma of the processed wind blast and the 18G rocket motor frequently resulted in compression fractures of the spine, severe concussions, and compound fractures of the spine below, lower limbs. The rescue teams were operating under the assumption that Captain Miller and Major Vance would be immobile or suffering from polytrauma, requiring a hot load extraction where the medical stabilization would happen mid-flight under fire. While the helicopters prepped, the aerial refueling logistics were being coordinated for the escort package. A KC-135 Stratotanker was redirected from a different sector to provide a fuel track over the Gulf of Oman, ensuring that the 4 FA-18 fighter jets assigned as the Sandy escort would have enough fuel to maintain a constant overhead presence. This aerial ballet required the coordination of over 200 personnel, from fuel handlers on the tanker to the radar controllers in Qatar, all focused on the recovery of 2 men. The intelligence failure that had led to the crash now forced a change in the rescue logistics. Because the HQ-9 battery was still active, the rescue helicopters could not fly a direct path. They were forced to plan a low-altitude nap of the Earth route through the canyons, a tactic that increased fuel consumption by 30% and placed the aircraft at constant risk from small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. The signature element of the crisis, the sheared antenna on Major Vance's radio, had not yet been discovered by the rescue coordinators. They were baffled by the lack of a beacon signal from the weapons system officer, leading to a grim assessment that Vance might have been killed during the ejection. On the hangar deck, the maintenance crews were already beginning the formal casualty report for the lost aircraft, a process that involved documenting the last known positions of every major component of Reaper 0-1. The loss of the airframe was a multi-million-dollar blow to the squadron's readiness, but the focus remained on the recovery of the human weapon systems. The rescue teams were issued blood chits, orange silk sheets printed in multiple regional languages, offering a reward for the safe return of American personnel, a final, low-tech insurance policy for a high-tech war. At 3:45, the order was given for the Quick Reaction Force to launch. The roar of the helicopter engines was a physical weight on the flight deck as the two MH-60 Sierra aircraft lifted into the dark, turning north toward the Iranian coast. They were flying into a gap between what the intelligence had predicted and what the terrain actually held, their survival depending on the skill of the pilots and the effectiveness of the medical gear packed into the cramped cabins. The mission was no longer about surveillance. It was a race to reach the survivors before the Iranian ground forces could close the distance. 4 in the morning. The jagged ridges of the Lar Plateau. The Iranian Search and Recovery Team, a specialized light infantry unit from the Revolutionary Guard, moved with a methodical, predatory discipline across the shale slopes. They were not the disorganized paramilitary forces described in the secondary intelligence assessments. These were professional mountain troops, equipped with Russian-made third-generation night vision goggles and thermal imaging sensors. The unit commander, a veteran of border security operations, split his 40-man company into 3 distinct search elements to envelop the crash site from the high ground. The sound of their boots crunching on the dry limestone was masked by the steady, mournful howl of the wind through the juniper trees. The tactical objective for the Iranian forces was the immediate capture of the American flight crew for intelligence, exploitation, and political leverage. They moved in a staggered line abreast, their AK-47 rifles held at the low ready, their eyes scanning for the telltale white silk of a parachute or the rhythmic blink of an infrared strobe light. The smell of the high desert dust, sage, and cold mineral was now tainted by the drifting acrid smoke from the burning Strike Eagle, which acted as a beacon for the search teams from over 10 miles away. 2 miles to the north of the main wreckage, Major Vance lay pressed into a narrow crevice beneath a limestone overhang. His body was a map of dull, throbbing pain from the 18G ejection and the violent landing on the jagged rocks. He could see the sweeping beams of high-powered flashlights dancing across the opposite ridge, less than 800 meters from his position. The signature element of his dire situation was clutched in his trembling right hand, the CSEL survival radio. He had attempted to transmit 15 times in the last hour, but he was met with nothing but the low, indifferent hiss of atmospheric static. Because of the antenna shear that had occurred when the stabilizer struck the fuselage, Vance's signal was physically incapable of punching through the heavy mineral content of the surrounding ridges. He was broadcasting with less than 10% of his intended wattage, his voice a ghost in the machine that did not even reach the rescue helicopters now crossing the coastline 40 miles to the south. To the Iranian searchers, the silence on the emergency frequencies was a tactical mystery. They had expected to direction find a powerful beacon immediately, and the lack of a signal led their commander to believe the Americans were either dead or using sophisticated low probability of intercept burst transmissions. The Iranian troops utilized a silent sweep technique, communicating with hand signals and low-frequency encrypted radios to avoid alerting the survivors. They were searching for the physical signature of the ejection seats, which contained heavy survival kits and high-visibility components. One search element discovered the discarded parachute of Captain Miller. The white nylon snagged on a cluster of thorns like a massive, pale shroud. The Iranian sergeant noted the blood on the rocks and the direction of the drag marks, pointing his squad toward the ravine where Miller was currently cornered. The environment was a hostile participant in the search. The temperature on the plateau had dropped to 34 degrees, and the thin air made every uphill scramble a lung-burning ordeal for the soldiers. The ground was a labyrinth of karst topography, deep sinkholes, and hidden caves that could hide a man for days or swallow him in a single misstep. The Iranian commander ordered 2 of his men to deploy a small, commercial-grade quadcopter drone equipped with a thermal camera. The device buzzed into the air, its tiny rotors sounding like a distant swarm of insects, as it began a grid search of the valley floor. Major Vance watched the drone pass overhead, the red LED blinking like a malevolent eye. He knew that if he stayed in the crevice, he would eventually be found by the thermal sweep. If he moved, his heat signature would stand out against the cooling rocks like a signal flare. He looked at his broken radio once more. The sheared-off stub of the antenna, a silent witness to the intelligence failure that had brought him to this desolate mountain. He was 40 miles from safety, his pilot was under fire, and the hunters were now less than 500 meters away. The search teams were closing the net with a professional patience that indicated they were in no hurry. They knew the Americans had nowhere to go. The Iranian commander checked his watch, noting that the first light of dawn was only 90 minutes away. Once the sun rose, the advantage of the American night vision would vanish, and the full weight of the regional ground forces could be brought to bear on the extraction point. The hunt was entering its most critical phase, and the silence of the broken radio continued to define the fate of the downed crew. 4:15 in the morning. The Iranian coastline near Bandar-e-Jask. The Combat Search and Rescue Task Force, designated Rescue 1, crossed the surf line at an altitude of 50 feet above the dark water. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were flying in a tight staggered formation, their rotors beating a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that vibrated through the airframe and into the chests of the pararescue jumpers. To their north and south, the 4 FA-18 fighter jets provided a high-altitude screen, their AN/APG-79 radars scanning the horizon for any signs of Iranian interceptors or active surface-to-air missile batteries. The flight path was a jagged line of waypoints designed to exploit the radar shadows created by the limestone cliffs and deep coastal canyons. The ingress was a high-stakes exercise in terrain masking and electronic silence. The pilots of the MH-60 Sierra aircraft were utilizing helmet-mounted night vision systems, their world rendered in shades of monochromatic green as they navigated the narrow gaps between the mountain peaks. They were flying at the absolute limit of their aircraft's performance, the heavy fuel load and auxiliary tanks making the helicopters sluggish in the thin, turbulent air of the ZAGROS interior. The tactical plan required them to maintain a speed of 120 knots, while staying below the detection threshold of the Iranian early warning network. Despite the precision of the flight, the search for the survivors was complicated by the ongoing mystery of the beacon signals. The task force was receiving a strong, intermittent pulse from Captain Miller's survival radio, but the frequency assigned to Major Vance remained a void of silence. The signature element of the disaster, the sheared antenna on Vance's radio, continued to baffle the mission controllers in Qatar. They had assessed the probability of a dual survival scenario as high. Yet, the physical reality of the broken antenna meant that Vance was effectively invisible to the advanced sensors of the rescue package. The electronic warfare environment was increasingly hostile as they moved deeper inland. The escort pilots reported several instances of ghosting on their displays, indicating that the Iranian air defense units were using sophisticated, deceptive jamming to hide their true positions. This was another direct contradiction of the pre-mission intelligence briefing, which had assessed the Iranian electronic warfare capability as legacy tier and easily suppressed. The rescue force was now operating in a sector where every ridgeline could hide a mobile radar or a man-portable air defense system. Sandy 1 to Rescue 1, I have a possible emitter at 3 o'clock, 10 miles out. The lead FA-18 pilot transmitted, his voice calm despite the mounting tension. The task force commander ordered a minor course correction to the west, putting another mountain range between the helicopters and the potential threat. The maneuver cost them an additional 3 minutes of fuel, a critical commodity given the 40-mile distance to the crash site. The pararescue jumpers in the back of the helicopters checked their weapons one final time. The green glow of the cabin lights reflecting off the matte black surfaces of their carbines. They were prepared for a high-intensity engagement on the ground, knowing that the Iranian forces had a 90-minute head start on the recovery. The smell inside the cabin was a mix of hydraulic fluid, salt spray from the coastal crossing, and the metallic scent of gun oil. The air was thick with the anticipation of the coming contact. As they reached the 30-mile mark, the terrain became even more vertical, forcing the helicopters to climb to 6,000 feet to clear the primary ridges. This move exposed them to the Iranian radar for 45 seconds, a window of vulnerability that felt like hours. To the crews, the rescue force was now within 10 miles of Captain Miller's last known position. They could see the faint, pulsing infrared strobe from his survival kit, a beacon of hope in the dark landscape. However, the lack of a second strobe from Major Vance forced the task force to prepare for a split extraction, a nightmare scenario that would double their time on the ground and increase the risk of being overwhelmed by the closing Iranian light infantry. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase, and the cost of the intelligence failure was about to be paid in the blood of the rescuers. 4:30 in the morning. The extraction point coordinates 27 degrees 22 minutes north, 54 degrees 18 minutes east. The first MH-60 Sierra helicopter, call sign Rescue 11, flared violently over the narrow ravine, its nose pitching up. As the pilot fought the turbulent mountain air to hover 10 feet above the jagged limestone, the downwash from the rotors was a physical force, a hurricane of white dust and sharp shale that flattened the juniper bushes and sent a wall of grit into the faces of the Iranian light infantry, closing in from the north. Before the wheels could even touch the uneven ground, 4 pararescue jumpers leaped from the side doors, their boots hitting the rocks with a heavy, metallic thud of tactical gear. The ravine erupted into a chaotic, two-way exchange of high-intensity fire. The Iranian search team, realizing their prize was slipping away, opened up with 3 PKM machine guns from the ridgeline. The heavy 7.62mm rounds shredded the air around the helicopter, punching dozens of holes through the thin aluminum skin of the tail boom and shattering the glass of a cabin window. One pararescue jumper was slammed backward as a round caught the ceramic plate of his body armor, the kinetic energy of the impact throwing him into the dirt with the force of a sledgehammer. He rolled instantly, his own carbine spitting, a controlled burst of 5.56mm fire toward the muzzle flashes on the ridge, suppressing fire. Get the survivor in the bird. The team leader shouted over the deafening roar of the rotors and the staccato rhythm of the rifles. Overhead, the Sandy escort 2 FA-18 fighter jets dived out of the darkness. They did not use missiles in such close proximity to friendly forces. Instead, they used their 20mm M61 Vulcan cannons. The sound of the cannons was a low, mechanical growl that echoed through the canyon like a physical weight. The high-explosive incendiary rounds walked across the Iranian ridgeline, the impacts turning the limestone into a spray of white dust and fire, momentarily silencing the enemy machine guns and allowing the rescue team to move. The pararescue jumpers reached Captain Miller behind his boulder. He was pale, his flight suit soaked in sweat and grease, his left ankle swollen to twice its normal size inside the boot. 2 jumpers grabbed his harness, literally dragging him across 30 meters of open ground, while the other 2 provided a wall of suppressive fire. They threw Miller into the cabin of Rescue 11, where a combat medic immediately began a secondary assessment, his hands moving with practiced speed to check for internal bleeding and spinal stability. But the mission was only half complete. Where is Vance? Where is Reaper 0-1 Bravo? The pilot transmitted, his voice tight with the strain of holding the hover. The signature element of the disaster now reached its breaking point. Captain Miller, shouting over the roar of the engines, pointed toward the northern ridges. He tried to explain that his radio was working, but Vance's was not. The task force commander in the second helicopter, Rescue 1-2, circled 2 miles to the north, his electronic sensors searching for any sign of the weapons system officer. Because of the sheared antenna on Major Vance's survival radio, the powerful receivers on the MH-60 Sierra could only pick up a faint, garbled pulse that sounded like background radiation. The signal was so weak it provided no directional data, leaving the rescue team to search a 3-square-mile area of jagged cliffs while under constant fire. Suddenly, a handheld green flare ignited in a deep crevice 600 meters to the northwest. Major Vance, realizing his radio had failed, had used his last visual signal as the Iranian scouts closed within 50 meters of his position. Rescue 1-2 dove toward the flare, the pilot ignoring the master caution lights on his dashboard as the aircraft's sensors detected a man-portable air defense system lock from a nearby peak. The helicopter hovered just long enough for the second team of pararescue jumpers to fast rope into the crevice. They found Vance wedged into a crack in the rock, his pistol empty, his face covered in the gray dust of the plateau. The recovery was a blur of violence. The jumpers engaged the Iranian scouts at a range of less than 15 meters, the muzzle flashes illuminating the narrow gap in the rock as they pulled Vance toward the hovering aircraft. The physical recovery of both crew members had taken exactly 9 minutes, but the cost was already visible. Both helicopters were riddled with small arms fire. One was leaking hydraulic fluid from a severed return line, and 2 pararescue jumpers were being treated for gunshot wounds. The smell of the cabin was a thick, sickening mix of burnt cordite, fresh blood, and the acrid smoke of the defensive flares. As the 2 MH-60 Sierra aircraft banked hard to the south, climbing for the safety of the coast, they left behind the burning wreckage of a $30 million aircraft and a mountain range that was now fully awake and searching for blood. The extraction was successful, but the retreat back across 40 miles of hostile airspace remained, with the Iranian air defense network still very much alive and searching for the low-flying targets. 4:45 in the morning. The southern Iranian coastline and the Gulf of Oman. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were moving at a speed of 130 knots, their airframes vibrating with a high-frequency shudder as they pushed through the thick, humid air of the lower altitudes. Behind them, the jagged silhouettes of the ZAGROS mountains were receding into the pre-dawn mist, but the threat from the HQ-9 battery remained active. The task force commander kept the formation at a steady altitude of 50 feet above the desert floor, utilizing every dry riverbed and rocky outcrop to stay below the horizon of the Iranian coastal radar. The mission had transitioned from a high-stakes extraction to a desperate logistical race against fuel exhaustion and mechanical failure. The logistics of the retreat were dictated by the damage sustained during the extraction firefight. Rescue 1-2 was operating, with a critical leak in the secondary hydraulic system, the fluid spraying a fine amber mist across the rear fuselage. The pilot was forced to use manual flight controls for the tail rotor, a physically exhausting task that required constant, minute corrections to prevent the helicopter from spinning into the terrain. In the back of the cabin, the pararescue jumpers were managing 3 casualties. Captain Miller with his shattered ankle, Major Vance with a severe concussion, and one of their own team members, who had taken a 7.62 millimeter round to the shoulder. The air inside the helicopters was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the chemical bite of aerosolized hydraulic fluid. The combat medic had established intravenous lines for all 3 men, hanging bags of saline and blood from the overhead racks, while the aircraft banked and jolted through the turbulence. Major Vance lay on the floor, his eyes unfocused as he clutched the broken survival radio. The signature element of his ordeal, the sheared antenna, was now a piece of jagged metal that he stared at with a quiet, hollow intensity. He knew that if he had not found the flare, the rescue force would have likely circled his position until their fuel hit the bingo limit, leaving him behind in the limestone crevices. As the task force crossed the surf line and moved over the open water of the Gulf of Oman, the fuel situation reached a critical threshold. The 4 F-15E escort fighters, having spent 30 minutes in full afterburner to suppress the Iranian ground forces, were now down to their final 2,000 pounds of fuel. They could not return to the aircraft carrier without a mid-air replenishment. The KC-135 Stratotanker, call sign Python 6-1, was orbiting at coordinates 25 degrees 40 minutes north, 58 degrees 10 minutes east. Its refueling booms extended and ready. The aerial refueling was a clinical, high-stress maneuver performed in the gray light of the approaching dawn. The F-15E fighters approached the tanker in pairs, their nose probes sliding into the baskets with the precision of a practice drill. Each aircraft took on 6,000 pounds of JP-5 fuel, the transfer taking less than 4 minutes per jet, while the helicopters continued their slow, steady crawl toward the carrier group. The tanker crew monitored the transfer from their rear station, watching the fuel flow rates as the task force prepared for the final approach to the USS Gerald R. Ford. The cost of the intelligence failure was now being totaled by the mission controllers. The loss of Reaper 0-1 was a confirmed hull loss, but the damage to the rescue helicopters was equally severe. Rescue 11 had taken over 40 hits from small arms fire, including damage to the main rotor blades that would require an immediate depot-level replacement. The maintenance crews on the carrier were already being alerted to prepare the hangar deck for the arrival of the damaged aircraft, while the medical department cleared the triage area for the incoming casualties. Captain Miller watched the sunrise over the water through the open side door of the helicopter. The orange light reflected off the white caps of the waves, a stark contrast to the black, unforgiving shadows of the mountains they had just left. He could feel the vibration of the engines through the floorboards, a steady heartbeat that signaled they were finally clear of the Iranian air defense envelope. The mission had achieved its primary goal of recovering the crew, but the tactical superiority of the United States Air Force had been challenged by a threat that was not supposed to exist. The helicopters were now 10 miles from the carrier strike group. The DDG-51 destroyer was visible on SPECH. The horizon, its radar systems tracking the flight with a protective vigilance. The rescue team began the final check of the POSIT, patience, ensuring all bandages were secure and the intravenous lines were flowing properly. The physical strain of the last 4 hours was etched into the faces of everyone in the cabin, a mixture of exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of a successful recovery. They were returning home, but the report they would carry with them would rewrite the intelligence assessments for the entire region. 5:15 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters crossed the stern of the carrier, their landing lights cutting through the hazy dawn air. The flight deck was a controlled chaos of colored jerseys, with the medical teams in white standing ready alongside the crash, and salvage crews in red. As the wheels of Rescue 11 touched down on landing spot 3, the engines began their 2-minute cool-down cycle, the high-pitched whine of the turbines finally beginning to subside. The heavy doors slid open, and the scent of the ZAGROS mountains, that mix of dry dust, juniper, and burnt electronics, was finally purged by the clean, salt-heavy air of the Gulf of Oman. The medical handoff was performed with the silent efficiency of a practiced ritual. Captain Miller was the first to be moved, his stretcher carried by 4 sailors toward the island elevator, his face tight with the lingering effects of the trauma and the morphine. Major Vance followed, walking with the assistance of 2 pararescue jumpers, his gait unsteady as he clutched a small plastic bag containing his personal effects. Inside that bag was the signature element of the night's failure, the survival radio with its sheared-off antenna stub. The piece of jagged metal was a silent testament to the thin margin between a successful recovery and a permanent loss in the Iranian wilderness. By 6 in the morning, the flight deck had returned to a state of guarded readiness, but the mood in the squadron ready room was somber. The loss of Reaper 0-1 was officially recorded in the ship's log as a combat loss, due to enemy surface-to-air fire. The formal investigation would eventually conclude that the Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment had fundamentally underestimated the mobility and integration of the HQ-9 batteries. This intelligence gap had not just cost the United States Air Force a $30 million F-15E Strike Eagle. It had nearly cost the lives of 2 elite aviators and the rescue teams that went in to find them. The physical cost of the mission was visible in the hangar bay. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were surrounded by maintenance stands, their fuselages covered in green zinc chromate primer, where the mechanics were patching over 52 separate bullet holes. The tail rotor of Rescue 1-2 was being completely removed, the internal gears shredded by the hydraulic failure that had nearly downed the aircraft over the water. These machines, though still standing, were mission-killed for at least a month, a significant reduction in the carrier's search and rescue capacity. During a period of heightened regional tension, the intelligence failure had been a catalyst for a broader strategic reassessment. The realization that the Iranian air defense network was more capable and more mobile than previously believed forced a total revision of the air tasking orders for the next 90 days. No aircraft would fly into the southern Iranian interior without a dedicated electronic warfare escort, and the reliance on satellite imagery that was more than 6 hours old was permanently suspended. The victory of the rescue was real, but it was a victory of individual bravery over a systemic failure of preparation. As the sun fully cleared the horizon, the USS Gerald R. Ford turned back into the wind to begin the day's scheduled flight operations. The carrier kept moving, its massive hull cutting through the deep blue of the Gulf, but the empty space on the hangar deck where Reaper 0-1 should have been parked was a constant reminder of the night's events. In the squadron locker room, a junior officer began the task of packing Captain Miller's personal belongings into a standard shipping crate, a routine procedure for a downed aircrew that felt unnecessarily final. The mission was technically accomplished, as the personnel were recovered and the sensitive data recorders had been destroyed in the crash. However, the resolution of the engagement left a lingering sense of uncertainty among the command staff. They had seen a side of the adversary that the briefing books had said did not exist, and the price of that knowledge was etched into the weary faces of the rescue crews and the scarred metal of their helicopters. The Zagros Mountains remained a dark, jagged silhouette to the north, a territory that had proven itself far more lethal than the intelligence reports had ever dared to suggest. The final image of the morning was the locker of Major Vance. It remained open, his civilian clothes still hanging inside, while his flight helmet sat on the top shelf with a layer of fine, gray Iranian dust still clinging to the visor. There was no celebration in the wardroom, only the quiet, heavy realization that the next mission would require a level of caution they had previously thought unnecessary. The mission was over, the crew was safe, but the tactical landscape of the Persian Gulf had changed forever in the span of a single, violent night.